The Orathi had a word for everything they took. That was the first thing I learned about them, back in the early months when the reclamation zone was still being drawn on paper maps by men who had never set foot in it. The briefing officer, a young lieutenant named Sorrel who wore her rank like it was holding her upright, stood at the front of a prefab room in the Candrel 2 Operations Center and told 42 engineers that the Orathi were survivalists. That was the approved word, survivalists. She said it the way you say a word that has been approved by someone above you, carefully, with both hands visible, like she was presenting it for inspection. The Orathi believe, she told us, that resources belong to whoever is most capable of using them. They have been operating under this framework for 600 years. Their expansion has been consistent and methodical. Every species they have encountered, they have assessed. Those who were capable, they traded with. Those who were not, they stripped. She paused there. Not a theatrical pause, a genuine one. She had the briefing materials in a folder, and she set them face down on the table, which told me she knew something was coming that hadn't been written down, something she'd been told in a meeting that hadn't made it into the official document, because official documents are for the record and some things are not for the record. Humans, she said, they were still deciding about. There was a moment in that room, 42 engineers absorbing the specific quality of that sentence. Still deciding, present tense. As in, the decision was ongoing. As in, 600 years of consistent policy had encountered humanity and had not yet reached a verdict. I looked at the man beside me, a senior tech named Weiss, who had been fixing communication arrays since before I was certified, and Weiss looked at me, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing useful to say. The briefing continued. We were given the relevant geography, the relevant history, the relevant diplomatic context, and the relevant protocols. We were told to avoid unnecessary contact with Orathi personnel. We were told that if contact was unavoidable, we should allow them to initiate. We were told that the official posture was one of cooperative coexistence, and that this posture was maintained through mutual respect and careful boundary observance. We were told a great many things in careful language. What we were told between the lines of all of that was, be very careful. We don't fully know what we're dealing with yet. I kept all of that and filed it, the way you file things you expect to need later. The reclamation zone was 400 kilometers of what the Orathi called reclaimed territory, a stretch of formerly inhabited land on the outer edge of the Candrel system's second moon that they had moved into 18 months prior, after the original inhabitants. A small, unaffiliated species called the Hevasi had been assessed and found wanting. The Hevasi were gone now. Where they had gone was a matter of some diplomatic delicacy and none of my concern in any professional capacity. What concerned me was the relay station. We had a relay station in the middle of that 400 kilometers. It had been there for 11 years, planted during the first survey wave when nobody had thought to ask whose ground it was sitting on, because in those early survey years, nobody had anticipated that the Orathi would push out this far this quickly. The station served as the backbone of the communication network for 6 human installations on Candrel 2. Without it, those 6 installations were functionally blind. They could manage local operations well enough, but the long-range relay was gone, the coordination network was gone, and 6 isolated outposts on a moon that was still being mapped were 6 very expensive problems waiting to become 6 very serious incidents. With the station operational, they were annoying but manageable. Without it, command had assessed, things would deteriorate in ways that were difficult to reverse. The primary power coupling had been throwing error codes for 3 months. Not a sudden failure, a gradual degradation, the kind of slow slide that gives you plenty of warning time to address it and then, if you don't, gives you a sudden cliff. 3 months of warning had elapsed. The cliff was approaching. Command had decided, after considerable deliberation that I was told about in summary and experienced in its effects, that the relay station needed maintenance. A human engineer had to go into the reclamation zone, transit the Orathi checkpoint at kilometer 60, reach the station at kilometer 90, fix the coupling, and come back. They sent me. I am, by trade, a communications engineer. I have been one for 22 years. I did my apprenticeship on a transit hub in the outer system, and my first posting was on a survey vessel where I was the youngest person on the crew by a decade, and I learned quickly that being young and wrong is expensive. So I learned to be thorough before I learned anything else. I fix things that other people need to talk through. I diagnose, I repair, I test, I document. I am methodical. People who know me well describe me as someone who enjoys the part of a problem that is not ambiguous, which is a polite way of saying I am more comfortable with machines than with people, which is mostly accurate. I am not a soldier. I carry a tool kit and a sidearm I qualified on once, in a dusty training range outside a base I was assigned to for 6 weeks and never returned to. I passed that qualification by 4 points, which is enough to be considered qualified and not enough to be considered comfortable with the weapon. I have carried it on every posting for reasons that are more bureaucratic than tactical, and I have drawn it from its holster twice in 22 years, both times to clean it. I am also, as my supervisor at the time noted with particular emphasis in the evaluation that preceded my assignment to this job, the only engineer on Candrel 2 who had any prior contact with Orathi individuals. That contact had consisted of 2 hours at a transit counter in the Veln System Hub 4 years earlier, where an Orathi customs official had methodically gone through my kit bag, catalogued every item in it with a flat device very similar to the one I would later encounter, and handed it all back to me with an expression I had been unable to read. I had stood very still during this process, had answered the official's questions in short, direct sentences, and had been passed through without incident. My supervisor felt this qualified me. I had not argued the point, partly because I had no better candidate to suggest and partly because I understood the real logic. They needed someone who had been through an Orathi assessment once and had not made it worse. That was the actual qualification, not expertise, not special knowledge, just had encountered one of them in a formal context and had come out the other side without creating a diplomatic incident. The bar was where it was. I was given a transit pass, a letter of clearance in 3 languages including what the diplomatic corps believed to be a functional rendering of Orathi script. They were somewhat apologetic about this, because their Orathi was still being calibrated, and the script rendering was an approximation. A translation device on a belt clip that the diplomatic corps had programmed with the best available Orathi vocabulary set. And a field pack that had been assembled by the quartermaster's office with considerable care. The care was evident in how the pack had been packed, nothing extraneous, nothing that could be misread, nothing that would give an Orathi assessor reason to ask complicated questions. 14 tools, selected specifically for the relay station repair. 2 power cells. A diagnostic reader. Field rations for 5 days, more than enough for the projected transit time. A water reclamation cylinder. A bedroll. I repacked it, not because the quartermaster had done it wrong, but because I pack my own kit. 22 years of specific habits. I know where things are when I pack them myself. I repacked everything exactly as they had packed it, in the same order, in the same positions. And under clip 7, before I sealed the pack, I put the flour back. I want to be precise about the flour, because precision matters when you're talking about something that small. It is a Candrel prairie flower, the ones that grow in the dust flats in the dry season, small yellow-petaled things about the diameter of a shirt button, with a dark brown center that smells faintly of dry earth when it's fresh and nothing at all when it's pressed, and dries flat without losing its shape if you press it correctly between wax paper with enough weight. My daughter Marin had found it the week before I shipped out. She had been walking back from the school block with a friend, and she had spotted it growing through a crack in the foundation of our quarters building. One small bright yellow thing coming up through the gray pressed concrete of the base's construction zone, and she had picked it carefully and brought it inside. She pressed it over 3 days, replacing the waxed paper each day with her geology textbook on top. The geology textbook was a physical print edition. She had chosen it specifically because it was the heaviest book in the quarters, she told me, and she had weighed several before selecting it. She is my daughter thorough. She comes by it honestly. When it was flat, she peeled it up with careful fingers. I watched her do this, sitting at the table with my packing spread around me, and she held it up to the light to check it. Both sides. She does this with specimens. She has done this since she was 6. Then she walked around the table to where the pack was sitting on the floor, and she crouched down and found clip 7 on the lower left exterior of the pack. She had watched me pack enough times to know where things were, and she tucked the flower into the flat space between the clip's base and the pack's outer shell, pressing it in with 2 fingers until it was seated flat. She said it was so something alive came with me. I looked at her for a moment. 9 years old, crouching beside my field pack with 2 careful fingers on a pressed prairie flower, completely serious. I told her I'd bring it back. She gave me the look she gives when she is logging a commitment. Promise. Promise, I said. I did not tell her about the Orathi. She was 9. There are things you don't put in a 9-year-old's head the night before you leave, not because she couldn't handle the information, which she probably could. She handles most things with a directness that still catches me off guard, but because some information changes the quality of the goodbye, and I wanted the goodbye to be the kind that keeps well. The kind that sits right in your chest for the duration of the trip and doesn't go sour. In the morning, she walked me to the vehicle bay and watched me load the crawler, and she didn't say anything until I climbed into the cab. And then she said, from the ground below the door, "Clip 7. Clip 7, I confirmed. She nodded. I drove. The transit road into the reclamation zone had once been a Hevasi supply track. You could still see where their markers had stood, small square depressions in the packed earth, regularly spaced, where posts had been pulled and whatever they'd held had been taken, carried into the Orathi inventory. The track itself was still usable. The Orathi had found it functional and kept it. That was how it worked with them. What was useful was kept. What was not was cleared. The track was useful for the same reason it had always been useful. It went where things needed to go. I drove a light utility crawler, open cab, roll bars, battery drive, dust screen across the front. It made 40 kilometers an hour on good ground and 30 on the soft sections, where the dry season wind had pushed fine material across the track. Most of the transit road was in the middle of those 2 numbers. I had driven worse roads on worse moons. The crawler was comfortable and the day was bright, and I had the translation device on my belt and the clearance letter in my left chest pocket and the pack in the seat beside me, and I drove. The landscape on Candrel 2's dry plains is wide and pale gold in the dry season, flat for long stretches, and then interrupted by low ridges of gray-brown stone that catch the sun sideways and throw long, sharp shadows in the early morning. The vegetation, where there is vegetation, grows low and tough, with the dusty gray-green of plants that do not waste anything on display. There are wide stretches with nothing growing at all, just the pale earth and the stone and the sky, which is a washed-out blue with a permanent high haze that turns the light bright and flat, the kind of light that shows you everything and flatters nothing. I have been on Candrel 2 for 3 years, and I have grown to find this landscape calming. There is nothing in it that pretends to be something it isn't. I had time to think on that drive. 90 kilometers at an average of 35 is 2.5 hours one way. I had the road and the landscape and the quiet, which is a type of quiet particular to open ground with no wind, a solid quiet, not an empty one. I thought about the relay station and the fault I was going to find, which I was already fairly certain I knew the shape of. Isolation seal failure on a primary junction, the most common failure mode for that generation of coupling hardware. I thought about Weiss, who had been posted to a different assignment 3 weeks prior and whose replacement was not yet up to speed. I thought about administrative things that needed doing. I thought about Marin. I thought, eventually, about the checkpoint. I had been through one Orathi assessment. I had been calm for it, which was both temperamental and tactical, because the temperament was already there and the tactic matched it. Stand still, answer directly, don't fill silence with words. Orathi assessors, from everything the diplomatic corps had documented, were not reassured by talking. Talking, in their framework, suggested that you were trying to manage their assessment, which meant you had something to hide, which meant the assessment needed to be more thorough, not less. Silence was not interpreted as hiding. Silence was interpreted as waiting, which was the correct posture. I rehearsed this. Not the words, you can't rehearse words when you don't know what they'll say, just the posture, hands visible, no sudden movements, let them work. The checkpoint appeared at kilometer 60, as specified. The barrier was a single horizontal bar of matte dark metal between two square posts. The engineering of it was simple and functional, exactly what you'd expect from beings who had been refining the design of things they needed to use for 600 years. No wasted material, no ornamentation. The barrier did what a barrier was supposed to do and nothing extra. To the right of the road was a shelter, 3 open sides, a roof, a low counter surface, and 3 Orathi standing in it who were already watching me as I slowed and stopped. The Orathi are roughly humanoid in the sense that they have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head positioned where you'd expect to find a head. The rough similarity ends there. They are taller than humans by about a third. These 3 were each close to 2¼ meters, and lean in the way of animals built for sustained movement over open ground, with no spare mass anywhere on them. Their skin is gray-brown, fine-grained, and does not reflect light. It absorbs it, the way flat stone does, and in the full light of midday it gave them a quality of looking slightly more present than their surroundings, more solid, like they were the original and the landscape was the copy. Their eyes are forward-facing and very pale, the iris almost colorless in direct sun. They move with a precision that is not military, it's older than military. It's the precision of beings for whom imprecision was an evolutionary cost they could not afford, and they have been paying that account forward for longer than humans have been writing things down. When they stand still, they stand completely still. That is the detail nobody warns you about, and it is the one that matters most. I had been warned about their height, about their coloring, about their assessment protocols. Nobody had thought to mention that when an Orathi is observing and not yet acting, they are still in a way that most biological creatures are not. Not holding still, not suppressing movement, actually still, down to the smallest motor detail, like a photograph of a being rather than the being. The 3 in the shelter were doing this when I pulled up, and the one who walked out to meet me broke from it cleanly. One moment a photograph and the next a living creature in motion, with no visible transition between. She came to 3 meters from the crawler and stopped. I put my hands on the steering bar, palms up. She had the flat device in her left hand. It was powered, the edge glow was visible even in the bright daylight. She looked at me for a moment, that pale gaze moving over me in what felt like a complete catalog in a few seconds, and then she said something in Orathi. The translation device on my belt took 2 seconds and produced, "You are carrying materials." "Yes," I said. She said the same phrase again, identically same 4 syllables, same flat tone. The translator gave me the same rendering, "You are carrying materials." And then, a half-beat later it revised, "Declare them." I understood. The phrase had 2 meanings depending on context, and the translator had caught up to the correct one. I reached into my left chest pocket slowly and produced the clearance letter. I held it out, face toward her. She did not come forward to take it. She looked at it from 3 meters. I could see her gaze move to it, absorb it, and then looked back at me. She said something and the translator produced, "I will catalog your materials," Exit the vehicle and place the pack on the ground. I stepped down from the crawler. The ground was hard-packed and dry. I lifted the pack from the passenger seat and set it on the earth beside the vehicle, then took 3 steps back, the way the briefing had specified. Give them the working space. Don't hover over your own kit. The assessment is theirs to run. You are present but not participating. She crouched beside the pack. What followed was the most methodical process I have ever watched another being perform, and I say that as someone who has been calibrating and troubleshooting precision equipment for 22 years. She did not rush. She did not skip. She worked from the top of the pack to the bottom, from the main compartment to the side pockets to the top flap to the exterior clips, and she handled each item with the same quality of attention, not rough, not careless, but also not hesitant. She had done this before. She had done this many times. The flat device registered each item as she held it up, and she applied, for each one, a small secondary instrument from a pouch on her belt, about the size of a finger, slender, which she held close to each object for 3 to 5 seconds before logging the result. The 14 tools individually, the diagnostic reader, the 2 power cells, each held for longer than the tools, 5 or 6 seconds each, the secondary instrument close, the field rations, which she opened 1 packet of and held the instrument to the contents and logged it, the water cylinder, the bedroll, unrolled partway and then rolled back. The clearance letter, examined on both sides, set in a separate position that suggested it had been noted but not categorized with the equipment. The translation device from my belt, which she gestured for and which I unclipped and passed to her, and which she examined and logged and returned. The sidearm, which she took from the holster on my belt and spent considerably longer with than any other item, perhaps 30 seconds, the instrument applied to multiple points, the flat device updated twice. She set it back on the ground with the rest. The 2 in the shelter had not moved. She worked the side pockets, she worked the top flap, she worked the exterior. Then she reached clip 7. Clip 7 is on the lower left exterior of the pack, standard retention clip, anodized metal, hinged, designed to secure a carabiner or a gear loop, or to be used as a convenient pass-through point for a line. It is a common piece of hardware. Nothing about it is unusual. The space between its base plate and the pack's outer shell is about 3 millimeters, enough for a flat piece of paper, or a card, or a pressed prairie wildflower about the diameter of a shirt button. Her fingers found it because she was being thorough, and clip 7 was part of the exterior, and she was not going to miss the exterior. She drew it out with 2 fingers, pinched just below the stem where the plant material was strongest, and lifted it. She held it up. A yellow-petaled prairie flower, dried and flat. Dark brown center, the fine veins in the petals catching the light, the diameter of a shirt button. She looked at it for 2 seconds, 3, 5. Then she looked at me. I did not speak. I stood with my hands at my sides and I looked back. She turned the flower once slowly, the way she had turned every item, but this time the motion was different. Every other item had been turned to place it correctly before the flat device. This rotation was something else. It was slower. It had a quality of uncertainty that I had not seen in any of her previous movements, and she had been moving with complete certainty up to this point. She looked at the flower for a long moment. Then she straightened and walked back to the shelter, still holding it. What followed, from my position 3 meters behind my own spread-out kit, was 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I was counting. This is a habit I have had for so long I no longer experience it as a choice. I count time when I am trying not to do anything else, because counting is something the part of my brain that generates anxiety can be assigned to do while the rest of me stays still and observes. 11 minutes and some seconds. During that time, the 3 Orathi in the shelter conducted a conversation in rapid Orathi that my translation device rendered in fragments, catching phrases and losing the thread between them. What I caught assembled from those fragments. A question from the assessor shortly after she entered. One of the other two responded with what sounded like a longer answer. Then a question from the third one. Then a pause of perhaps 40 seconds in which nobody spoke at all and I caught nothing. Then the assessor again, a phrase that the translator caught cleanly. No assessed function. A response from one of the others, too fast to render. Then a longer exchange, multiple short turns, back and forth, the pace of people working through something by talking around it from different angles. And then twice, said slowly, clearly, with a pause between the two instances, no category. The second instance had a different quality. The first was a finding, the second was a conclusion. After that, the conversation stopped. For the last 3 minutes of the 11, the shelter was quiet, and all three of them were still, which was the particular quality of stillness I had already noticed. Not waiting, not thinking, simply existing in the current state while something processed that had no outward motion. At 11 minutes and some seconds, the assessor walked back out. She came to 3 meters. She was still holding the flower. She held it up between us. She said something. The translator processed it for 6 seconds, which was the longest single processing time of the whole encounter, and then gave me, "This has no assessed function." "No," I said. She said something else. "Translator, it has no material value." "No," I said. She looked at the flower again. Then she said something that took the translator 7 seconds. "It is not a survival resource." "No," I said, "it isn't." Another pause. She held the flower at about eye level between us, the pale light coming in flat and catching the petal texture. She said something. 9 seconds for the translator. What came back was, "Why is it here?" Not a question, a statement with an open end. The gap in the catalog stated plainly, "Fill it." I had been thinking during those 11 minutes about how to answer this if it came. I had gone through several versions. The official answer: it is a personal item permitted under the transit clearance. See Section 4 of the attached letter. Was accurate and was also the kind of answer that treats an Orathi assessor as a bureaucratic obstacle to be managed. And the assessor had just spent 11 minutes in a shelter working through something with her colleagues that she had never encountered in 600 years of collective cataloging. She deserved a real answer. "My daughter put it there," I said. The translator converted it. She received it. She looked at me. "She's 9 years old," I said. "She found it growing through the foundation of our building. She pressed it and tucked it under clip 7 the night before I left. She said it was so something alive came with me." I waited for the translator to work. I watched her face while it did, which was an exercise in learning to read things I did not have the prior experience to read. Orathi faces do not map cleanly onto human expressions. The musculature is different. The structure is different. What would indicate an emotion in a human face does not indicate the same emotion, or necessarily any emotion, in an Orathi face. But something happened around her eyes while the translation completed. Some change in the quality of her attention, which was already very focused and became focused in a different way. More still, if that was possible. She said, "The daughter is not here." "No," I said, "she's at the installation. 90 kilometers west." Another short exchange with the shelter. The translator caught fragments, the phrase "no category" again, and then a longer word it could not render, and then one of the others said something in 2 flat syllables, conclusive, and then silence. The assessor looked at the flower for another long moment. Then she walked the 3 meters to where I was standing and held it out. I took it. She said something and the translator gave me, "The catalog is complete. You may proceed." She stepped back. She returned to the shelter, the barrier lifted. I crouched and began repacking. I was careful. I placed each item where I had it before in the same order with the same positioning. The tools, the power cells, the diagnostic reader, the rations, the water cylinder. The bedroll, the sidearm back in the holster, the translation device back on the belt. Last, I put the flower back under clip 7 and sealed the clip. I stood, shouldered the pack, climbed back into the crawler and drove through. The relay station occupied a low concrete pad at the edge of a dry creek bed, one of the survey-era structures that had been built to function and not to be looked at. Steel and concrete in the way of things made to last and not to impress, with the junction boxes and relay housings arrayed in a sensible configuration around the primary coupling housing, and a small equipment room to the south side where you could shelter if the weather turned and work if the light was bad. Solar collection along the roof. The station looked exactly like what it was. 11 years old and still serviceable, working at 90% capacity and degrading, with a known fault that needed a known fix. I ran the diagnostic first. The full sequence, all systems, not just the coupling, because you fix what you can see and you check for what you can't. And I had not been out here in 18 months, and the Orathi had moved into the surrounding zone in the interim. The diagnostic came back clean on everything except the primary coupling, exactly as the error logs had predicted. Isolation seal failure on junction 3, the material having gone brittle over time and under load. A textbook failure mode for this generation of hardware, the kind that the engineering bulletins had flagged 4 years ago as a watch item. I had the replacement seal in the toolkit. I had the tool to extract the junction housing. I had done this specific repair twice before on similar equipment, once on a survey vessel and once on a fixed installation that was otherwise very different from this one but had used the same coupling generation. I did not need to think through the procedure. I just did it. The extraction took 8 minutes. The seal replacement took 12. The reinstallation and torque verification took 6. I ran a partial diagnostic at that point, just the coupling, and it came back green. I ran the full handshake sequence, all 6 of the downstream installations acknowledging, one by one, in a row of green lights on the diagnostic reader's output panel. 6 for 6, clean. I sat on the edge of the concrete pad and ate a ration and drank from the water cylinder and let the afternoon light come in sideways off the stone ridges to the east. The dry creek bed below the pad was pale and still. No wind. The same quality of quiet as the road in. I thought about what had happened at the checkpoint. I have, over 22 years, developed a habit of thinking through events that I do not fully understand by reducing them to their component parts and examining the parts in sequence. It is the same process as diagnosing a fault in a system. Isolate the variable, examine the behavior, compare to expected behavior, determine the nature of the discrepancy. This process works very well for mechanical systems. It works less well for events that involve beings other than myself, because beings other than myself have variables I cannot fully access. But it is the process I have, and I applied it. What happened? An Orathi assessor conducted a standard transit assessment. She cataloged 14 tools, 2 power cells, a diagnostic reader, a water cylinder, a bedroll, field rations, a sidearm, a translation device, and a clearance letter without incident or extended pause. She then found, under clip 7, a pressed prairie wildflower approximately the diameter of a shirt button. This item halted the assessment for 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, 3 Orathi engaged in a consultation for which I had partial translation, the key phrase of which, heard twice, stated slowly, was *no category. At the conclusion of the consultation, the assessor returned the item and passed me through. Expected behavior based on 600 years of documented Orathi assessment practice would have been one of 2 things. Either the item would have been cataloged under an existing category, personal effects, biological material, inert organic matter, and passed through with the rest, or the item would have been retained as a resource that could be better used by someone else. The item had been assessed as having no function, no material value, and no survival utility. Under Orathi logic, an item with no function, no value, and no utility should be easy to categorize as disposable and either left or retained without ceremony. Instead, It had triggered 11 minutes of consultation and been returned. The discrepancy, the item's lack of utility, was not causing it to be dismissed. Its lack of utility was causing it to resist categorization entirely, which meant that the Orathi categorical system, refined over 600 years of cataloging everything that every assessed species carried, did not have a container for an item that served no function and had no value, and had been placed there because a 9-year-old wanted something alive to travel with her father. The system had encountered a gap. I sat on the concrete pad until the light shifted and the air cooled, and then I went inside and bedded down. I slept well. I always sleep well in equipment rooms. There is something about the sound of running systems, the low background hum of electronics, the occasional click and cycle of automated processes that I find settling. The relay station ran quietly and correctly, the way it was supposed to now that the coupling was fixed, and I slept through the night and woke with the light. I repacked my kit. I did a final visual check of the station, all lights green, all housings correctly seated, no visible issues with the exterior components. I locked the equipment room. I loaded the crawler. I drove back. The drive was the same road and the same light in the reverse direction, which is not the same experience. The shadows fall differently. The ridges have different shapes from the east side. The distant low mountains that you can see from the western approach are behind you, and the pale flat of the dust flats is ahead. It is, in the way of familiar things seen from a different angle, like meeting someone you know in a context where you haven't encountered them before. The same and not the same. I thought about the checkpoint. I thought about clip 7. I had made a promise. I was bringing the flower back. That part was not complicated. What I thought about more carefully was how to handle the return assessment. The briefing had covered outbound transit. It had said less about inbound, on the assumption that having gone through once without incident, the return would be straightforward. I would declare the same kit minus whatever I had used, they would verify, they would pass me through. Standard protocol. But standard protocol had not included 11 minutes of consultation the first time, and I did not know whether the return transit would trigger a follow-up inquiry, or whether the record of the outbound assessment would change the inbound process. I decided to continue doing what I had done the first time. Answer directly, volunteer nothing, let them lead. The barrier was down. The shelter looked exactly as it had. The same assessor, or one that looked the same, was in the shelter with the same 2 others. She came out at the same point, the same distance, with the flat device. She looked at me, the same complete scan, top to bottom. Returning, I said, before the translator could prompt anything. She received the word. She said something and the translator produced. You completed the task. Yes. She looked at the pack on the passenger seat. She said something. Translator, the materials are the same. Yes, I said. I used 2 tools and 1 power cell. Everything else is the same. She looked at me, a short pause. Then she said something and the translator took a moment and then gave me 1 word. Clip 7. I reached for the pack. I unclipped the retention clip and drew out the flower between 2 fingers and held it up. She looked at it. She did not look at the flat device. She looked at the flower. She said it returned also. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The 2 in the shelter were watching, and they were the particular quality of still I had come to recognize as attention. Then she said something, and the translator worked through it in pieces, more slowly than it had worked through anything in the outbound transit, the way it slows when the sentence structure is doing something outside its primary training set. What came back, assembled from 3 separate processing beats. In 600 years of cataloging, we have not found a category for something carried with no function, no value, and no survival use, that was still present on return. I didn't speak. She said something else. Translator, We have a word for items that are taken. We have a word for items that are kept. We do not have a word for this. She raised the flat device and made a notation. Then she lowered it and said something, and this time the translator was faster. The daughter. She asked you to return it. Yes, I said. And you will. Yes. She looked at the flower one more time, the same quality of attention as the first time, but without the 11 minutes. Whatever she had needed to work through on the way out, she had worked through. This was something else. Something that looked, if I was reading it at all correctly, like the absence of the need to resolve it. Like the thing had been filed not under a category but under a note that said, "This does not have a category," and the note was enough. She stepped back. She said something that the translator reduced to 5 words. Proceed. The catalog is updated. The barrier lifted. I drove through. I have been asked in the months since to explain what happened at the Orathi checkpoint in the reclamation zone. I have been asked by the diplomatic corps, who sent 2 people to Candrel 2 specifically to debrief me, one of whom was a specialist in Orathi interaction protocol, and one of whom was a senior officer whose rank I was told, and then forgot because I am bad with rank. I have been asked by the Military Intelligence Division, in a separate session, conducted with more formality and more questions about the exact translation renderings, which they asked to have repeated several times, and appeared to find significant in ways they did not explain. I have been asked by a sociologist at the Candrel Research Station named Dr. Vell, who was writing a paper for a journal on xenocultural assessment frameworks, and who had the best questions of any of the 4 groups. I have been asked by my supervisor, who wanted to know, primarily, why the transit log showed an 11-minute stop at the checkpoint when standard procedure was 2 to 3 minutes, and whether there had been an incident. I told them all the same account, in varying levels of detail. I told them about the assessment, the methodical unpacking, the catalog of the kit. I told them about Clip 7. I told them about the 11 minutes, the consultation in the shelter, the phrase the translator had caught twice, no category. I told them about the return transit and what she had said. I read the translation renderings back as accurately as I could, noting the processing times and the places where the translator had been slower than usual, which Dr. Vell found particularly interesting, and which the intelligence officer seemed to find significant for different reasons. Dr. Vell used, in the paper she subsequently published, phrases I had not encountered before: categorical disruption, conceptual lacuna, asymmetric valuation framework, the paradox of zero-utility persistence. She wrote 14 pages. I read 7 of them before concluding that she had understood the event correctly and was expressing it in a language I did not speak particularly fluently, and that her version and my version were the same event in different vocabularies. The diplomatic corps found the account useful in ways they were careful to describe only in general terms. Military intelligence filed it. I was not told under what category. My supervisor wanted to know about the transit log. What I have not been asked, and what I have thought about more than any of the official follow-up, is why she gave it back the first time. Not why they let me through. I understand that part more or less. The outbound assessment had found no contraband, no hidden capability, nothing that overrode the clearance letter. I was a single engineer with a repair kit and a diplomatic transit pass, and the survivalist calculation was presumably that detaining me was more friction than passing me through, and friction has costs, and the Orathi do not pay costs they do not have to pay. The clearance, the diplomatic preparation, the prior existence of the relay station as an established human presence in the zone, all of those things had presumably been weighed and found sufficient. But she could have kept the flower. It had no function, no material value, no survival utility. Those were her exact assessments stated to my face. An item with no function, no value, and no survival utility is, in the Orathi framework, an item that has no claimant, because the Orathi concept of ownership is functional. You own what you can use. If you cannot use it, you do not own it, which means anything assessed as zero utility is, in their framework, unclaimed, available for reclamation. She had it in her hand. She had held it for 11 minutes. She had consulted with 2 others. She had found at the end of that consultation that she could not put it in a category. And she gave it back. The engineer's analysis, the one that fits the observable facts without requiring me to claim more than I know, is this. When the Orathi encounter an item that resists categorization, they cannot apply their standard protocol to it. Standard protocol, retain if useful, pass through if not, reclaim if questionable, requires a category. Without a category, the protocol has nothing to run on. The item exists outside the framework. It cannot be claimed because it cannot be assessed, and it cannot be assessed because it has no category. And it has no category because in 600 years of cataloging every item carried by every species the Orathi have encountered, they have never before found anything that was carried with no purpose, except that a child wanted something alive to travel with her father. The item was uncategorizable, therefore it was unclaimable, therefore the only action available was to return it. That is the engineer's answer. It is, I am aware, incomplete, because it accounts for the mechanics and it does not account for the 11 minutes. The mechanics would have produced the return quickly, zero utility, no category, pass through. The 11 minutes were not mechanical. The 11 minutes were 3 beings who had been cataloging the cargo of civilizations for 600 years, sitting in a shelter on a pale gold plain, working through what it meant that they had encountered, for the first time, something carried with no survival purpose and no assessed value. Only a child's specific and particular wish that her father not travel alone. I do not know what that worked through to. I only know the notation she made on the flat device when I came back through. The catalog is updated. Updated with what, I cannot say. But something had been written down that had not existed in the catalog before I drove through clip 7 in either direction. I want to tell you about Marin, because she is why the rest of this matters, and because the official account does not include her. She was 9 when I left for the reclamation zone, and she was 9 when I came back 11 days later, because the repair had gone cleanly, and the post-op diagnostics had checked out, and there was no operational reason to extend the stay. The transit back from the station to the installation was 4 hours at road speed, and I drove it in the flat afternoon light with the flower back under clip 7, and the 6 green lights from the relay station's handshake still in my head. The particular satisfaction of a repair that went exactly as expected, clean and complete. Marin was sitting in the access corridor of our quarters block when I came through the main door. She had a geology textbook open across her knees, possibly the same one, and she was reading it with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided were worth her time, which is most things. She looked up and saw me and the pack on my back, and she stood up fast, the way kids stand when they are trying not to run, when they have decided that running would be undignified but the impulse is there and visible. I crouched down to her level and I unclipped clip 7, and I drew out the flower and held it out. She took it with both hands. She looked at it for a long time, turning it once, the way she always checks specimens, checking that it had come through intact. It had. The pressing had done its job, the clip had protected it, and whatever the assessor had done with it during those 11 minutes in the shelter had not damaged it. It was the same button-sized yellow flower it had been when Marin had put it there. She looked up at me. "Did anything happen to it?" she asked. "It had a moment," I said. She looked at me, waiting with the patience she uses when she knows a longer answer is coming, and is prepared to wait for it. "There are beings out there," I told her, "who go through everything anyone carries. They've done this for 600 years. Every species they've met, every piece of kit, every resource. They catalog everything. They have a word for everything they take." Marin was listening, with the quality of attention she reserves for things she has classified as important. "They found your flower," I said, "under clip 7, and they took it into their shelter and they sat with it for 11 minutes, and they couldn't find a category for it." She thought about this for a moment. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, and I took a breath because I wanted to get this right, "that in 600 years of cataloging everything every species carries, they had never found anything like it. They'd cataloged weapons and tools and food and medicine and equipment, things with functions, things with value, things that serve a survival purpose." I looked at the flower in her hands. "And they'd never found something that someone was carrying with no function, no value, and no survival use, only because their daughter wanted something alive to come with them." Marin looked at the flower. "They gave it back," I said, "because they didn't have a word for it." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Did it scare them?" I thought about the quality of stillness in the shelter, the 11 minutes, the word that had come twice slowly, the assessor's face when the translation came through, the notation made on the flat device. "I don't know," I said, and it was honest. "I think it made them think." Marin nodded, the filing nod. She looked at the flower one more time, both sides thorough. Then she closed her hands around it carefully and said, "I'm going to press it again." "All right," I said. "And next time you go somewhere, I'm putting it back." I looked at her, 9 years old, completely certain. "All right," I said. "There is a postscript to this account, and I include it because it happened, and because leaving it out would make the account incomplete. 4 months after my transit through the reclamation zone, the diplomatic corps received a formal written communication from the Arathi Reclamation Authority. It was addressed to the Human Administration on Candrel 2, and it concerned the status of human installations within the zone. The diplomatic corps spent 3 weeks processing it with their translation specialists, because Arathi formal communications are syntactically dense, and the translation AI had, at that time, been calibrated primarily for conversational and assessment register, rather than administrative and legal. What they produced, after 3 weeks, was a rendered summary accompanied by extensive translator's notes and several flagged passages where certainty was qualified. What the communication said, in summary, was this: the Arathi Reclamation Authority had completed its assessment of human installations in the reclamation zone. It had found that human installations were, in several respects, operating at below optimal efficiency, accurate, and that human personnel were, in several respects, carrying and using materials in ways that did not reflect maximum assessed capability, also accurate, in the way that any honest assessment would be. Under standard Arathi protocol, this assessment would have resulted in a reclamation order for the territory. The communication then stated that the assessment had been complicated by a cataloging anomaly, that the authority was not prepared to resolve under standard protocol. The specific phrase used, which the translator's notes flagged for extended discussion, was rendered provisionally as an item in transit that falls outside existing assessment categories cannot be assessed, and an installation connected to or productive of uncategorizable items cannot be assessed by the same criteria as otherwise similar installations. The relay station was granted provisional operating status. So were the 5 other human installations in the zone. The provisional status was subject to annual review and was conditioned on continued human presence within the zone's designated transit corridors. The diplomatic corps was very pleased. Several people were sent to Candrel 2 to study what had happened and why, and those people wrote reports, and those reports went into files I was not cleared to read, and the sociologist's paper was subsequently circulated in certain departments and found to generate discussion. Meetings were held. Policy was reviewed. Things were set in motion that will take years to become visible if they ever do. I was given a commendation for the successful maintenance of the relay station under difficult field conditions. The commendation noted my transit through the reclamation zone checkpoint without incident, and credited the clearance letter and the diplomatic preparation of the Candrel II administration. It commended my professionalism and composure. It did not mention Clip 7. I did not correct the record. There are things that don't fit the official categories. You file them where you can. I am writing this down because Dr. Vell asked me to, a year after the transit and 6 months after her paper was published, when the paper had been read by more people than either of us had anticipated, and she wanted a first-person account to accompany a follow-up piece. I told her I would write it myself because I did not want the words to be someone else's, and she agreed, on the condition that she could ask me questions afterward. Her first question, after she read the draft, was, "What do you think they wrote in the catalog?" I told her I didn't know. Her second question was, "If you had to guess." I thought about it for a long time before I answered. Then I said, "I think they wrote down that they had found something that couldn't be claimed, and I think they wrote down why. And I think that is the first time in 600 years that their catalog has a record of something unclaimed for a reason they don't have a word for." Dr. Vell wrote that down. Then she said, "Do you think they'll find the word?" "I don't know," I said, "but I think they're looking." What I want this account to convey, and what I am not sure the official records or the sociological paper can convey, because they are written in languages suited to different purposes, is the precise, specific, small thing at the center of all of it. Not the diplomatic outcome, not the provisional status, not the commendation or the paper or the meetings in offices I was not invited to, not the phrase categorical disruption or asymmetric valuation framework or the paradox of zero utility persistence. These are the frames around the thing. They are not the thing. The thing is a pressed prairie wildflower, yellow-petaled, about the diameter of a shirt button, dark brown center. It dries flat without losing its shape. It has no assessed function. It has no material value. It is not a survival resource. It was found growing through a crack in the foundation of a base building by a 9-year-old who thought it was worth saving, and was pressed flat with a geology textbook over 3 days, and was tucked under Clip 7 by 2 careful fingers on the night before I left, and traveled 90 kilometers into a reclaimed zone, and sat in an Orathi assessor's hand for 11 minutes while 3 beings who had been cataloging the cargo of civilizations for 600 years looked at it and found, for the first time, that they did not have a word for what they were holding, and was returned, and came home. Marin is 12 now. She pressed it again when I got back, same textbook, same waxed paper. When it was flat, she peeled it up and handed it to me and said, "Clip 7, and I put it there. I leave again in 3 weeks. Different posting, different transit, no confirmed Orathi checkpoint on the current routing, though the routing is based on information that is 4 months old, and the Orathi have been moving consistently, and I have learned not to assume that the absence of a confirmed checkpoint means the absence of a checkpoint. But the pack is already in the equipment room. Clip 7 is loaded. The flower is there, flat and yellow and the diameter of a shirt button. Whatever comes next will find what it finds when it looks there." "Something alive," my daughter said. "That is the specification. That is the load-bearing detail, the one that carries the whole weight of this account, the one that 11 minutes in a shelter on a pale gold plain could not be resolved by 600 years of categorical thinking. That is the one small thing I packed that the pack was not designed to carry, and that carried more than everything else in it put together. Something alive. Everything else is logistics.